Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam, and today I am interviewing Rachelle Udell. Rachelle has been an active contributor to Mage for years. She has written, handled game design, and even developer duties for Sorcerer's Crusade. Although her body of work gives us much to discuss, today we're focusing on her chapter in the just-released Forbidden and Forgotten Orders. She has written the largest piece to date on the Ngoma, I believe it is, a disparate faction of mages sometimes called crafts. Rachelle, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to our listeners. How are you this evening?
I am fantastic. Thank you.
You have written for many White Wolf and Onyx Path games. What was the first Mage project for you?
That's like deep in the mists of time. I really can't even remember what the very first thing was. I think Phil Briccato gave me a section to write in, it wasn't the Orphans book. It was one of the tradition books that they were revising. Maybe it was Euthanatos, maybe it was Verbena. I can't even remember.
Of all the Mage books you wrote for, which was your favorite to work on?
It's kind of like asking which one of your children do you like the best? Because I really enjoyed working on pretty much everything that I've written for, this Mage universe that we all live in. But I guess if I had to pick a favorite, I would really say I enjoyed working on Mage Las Vegas the best. That to me was one of my favorite ones to work on, just because I contributed a lot to that particular book, and the characters that I created for that city and for guiding story or setup story there in Las Vegas. I fell in love with those characters. I liked them. I thought they were interesting people. And, they were a lot of fun to write. That particular city and storyline was fun to research, and it was fun to write. And I think if I had to pick a favorite, it would probably be that one.
Well, I would say it shows. I read that book not too long ago, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you for what you did for us there. It's a good book on my shelf. I like to pull it down sometimes. Well, Forbidden and Forgotten Orders is an amazing book that details 11 groups of mages involved with the Disparate Alliance. Several of these groups are getting more than 2 pages of material for the first time. Before we get into the details of your new chapter, can you help us with the pronunciation of the craft's name? I ask because Rachelle is a linguist, so she's in a great position to help us here.
So in terms of pronunciation, there are 3 ways that you can pronounce in English, we don't have the N sound and the G sound occurring together at the beginning of a word. So our language doesn't have that sound. And in the African languages that do use that sound, there are different ways that you can go about pronouncing it. So you can make the N completely silent and just pronounce it Ngoma. It's not a G like by itself. It's sort of like you form the N nasal in your mouth and then you say a G. So it's Ngoma. Kind of like when you say the word sing, that sound, you start there from that shape in your mouth and then just say the G. So that's the best way I can describe how to say that sound.
So if I say Ngoma, is that close?
No, it's not Ngoma. It's more like Ngoma. So, or you can say Ngoma, or Ngoma. So it's either an ing sound or an eng sound. But usually, I just kind of go with the silent N and just call it Ngoma.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. On page 21, we see the Ngoma have reestablished the kingdom of, I believe it's Kush, as their seat of power in the enlightened world. What exactly does that mean? The former kingdom of Kush was mostly in modern Sudan from my research. Do they have a headquarters in Sudan?
Yes, actually. So one of the things that I was going for with this was I was looking at in the history of magical traditions in Northern Africa. I was looking at it, and most people kind of tend to go towards Egypt, but people tend to forget that there's this whole other sister kingdom that existed south of Egypt, which is where modern day Sudan is. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of significant, archaeological sites in Sudan that were connected with the kingdom of Kush, and with the Nubian people. And I thought, hey, that would probably be a good place to kind of centralize where this magical tradition kind of had their roots and where they are now. And largely it's because of this idea of the libraries. One of the things that often kind of infuriates me, and I did put this into the chapter in the fiction as well, was this idea of everybody loves to think about, oh, how horrible a tragedy it was that we lost the great library of Alexandria, as if that's like the only library that ever existed. And it's like, no, there were lots of even better libraries all across the African continent, particularly in the area of Nubia and the Ethiopian lands, and onward into, North Central Africa and the Western African nations. So, that to me, by having this new Kush be in modern day Sudan and in relatively the same place where those original libraries were, that to me was very important, to centralize things there, just to kind of call attention to the fact that, there were other magical and mystical traditions aside from Egypt, which is the one that everybody knows about, and the associations with Alexandria.
So they probably have a chantry there with respectable resources.
Oh yes, absolutely. And that was kind of one of the key ideas that I had when I was writing this chapter, was this idea of scholars and libraries and what that means, and what that means in particular for people who were scattered and nearly destroyed by colonization and the ravages of colonization, of cultural and spiritual appropriation and things like that. How important would it be to preserve the knowledge that you have and to build on that knowledge, and then go out and try to share that with all the people that were scattered all across the world? To me, that seemed very important. So that was something that I wanted to emphasize when I was crafting this chapter and thinking about who these people are and what we wanted them to be about.
As a storyteller, that gives me a good handle to work with this group as NPCs. I remember in some past games, players would say, I want to go talk to the Hermetics. And I said, so you like the Hermetics? Like, no, they've got libraries. I want to see what books are on those shelves. I want to see the library. And it's like, okay, so this is how I can bring the Ngoma into my games. People are going to say, they've got these awesome libraries. I want to go see. It's like, okay, now we can bring this in and work with them. So as a storyteller, I certainly do appreciate that. But what specifically is the New Kush initiative trying to accomplish? It sounded really interesting, but I just couldn't get a clear sense of, I think I know what they like and what they want, but when you say New Kush initiative, it sounds quite specific, like a specific group of people who are working towards specific goals.
Yes. So the goal that they really have is that they have multiple goals. One of the biggest surface goals is to push back on a lot of the negative and dismissive and derisive narratives that were put forth by essentially colonizing European, and also the European mages in particular, the Hermetics being one of those groups that they have particular issue with. And this idea that that there were no intellectual traditions, that, the peoples of Africa were just sort of these uneducated, unwashed heathens with nothing, that they had nothing until the Europeans arrived and gave them everything. This idea that their goal is to counter a lot of that historical erasure, first of all, not just in terms of magical tradition, but also in terms of just societal tradition. It's like, hey, we're not all living in mud huts and starving down here. We come from ancient traditions that, it didn't take the Greeks and the Romans to quote unquote civilize us. We were civilized before they showed up, and, we had libraries before they showed up, and we had systems of knowledge and ways of viewing the world and the universe that are useful in today's world. This wealth of knowledge that we've had that's been suppressed or, exploited or distorted for whatever reason. We want to make sure that the truth gets out and that we can benefit not just the people who were affected by the diaspora, but also people all over the world. I think I wrote somewhere in there, it wasn't enough for them to say, okay, yes, we have established, this new, what we are calling Kingdom of Kush in the physical enlightened world. Our goal is to create this sort of new vision of modern civil society that is the ultimate goal is to unite every nation, every tribe, every clan, every society, both enlightened and awakened, across the entirety of the motherland and even beyond that at some point. So, this idea that to do that, what we really need to do is to reclaim the knowledge and the artifacts and the rituals and everything that essentially was looted from our ancient libraries and carried off to all of these libraries in Europe. If we can get this stuff back, or if we can find it and then contextualize it, dispel the myths around it and then contextualize it so that the people there can actually use things the correct way instead of the wrong way, or in ways that might be harmful to them, for example, then that will help to further our goal to, bring everything back together, to recreate this, ancient seat of knowledge that we once had.
Okay, well, yeah, that helps me see how they start with the specific goals and work towards the more general goals. So that does help. I heard mention in this chapter of oracles who were talking with the leadership of the Ngoma. Are the oracles mentioned in this chapter the same kind of oracles we get in the first and second edition rule books, or is this a different use of the word?
I saw this as being something a little bit different. To me, oracles are individuals or groups of individuals, or even places that individuals can go to connect with the ancestors.
Okay, so this is a more general use of the word oracle, not the Mage Lore specific one. Okay,
no, that does not the Mage Lore specifically.
Okay,
now,
that does help.
If a storyteller wanted to make them more kind of like those, then that is completely up to you. But when I was thinking about this originally, I was thinking mainly about, this idea of places and people that members of this community can go to. So maybe you are not the most adept person at contacting the ancestors. You have a relationship with the ancestors, but you need to talk to someone far more powerful than you have the either will or inclination to contact. So it's safer often to go to one of these oracles and to kind of consult with them. These are people who are connected to those original figures of Taur that they are the ones that are connected to those deep ancestors who can see all things in all times. And so they're the ones that are kind of saying, okay, yes, this is the unadulterated vision that we are receiving from our ancestors, not necessarily the overarching oracles as they are in like the first and second edition rule books.
Yeah, well, that does give me a better understanding. And again, it's a good resource. I like it when there are specific resources that a mage faction has that the younger members want to make use of, and so that gives a storyteller plot hooks to bring that group into the game, especially if one of those players are in the player group. So the focus on scholarship and leadership made this craft more appealing to me. I see it as an encouragement to players to build alliances, form new groups, and become envoys. Did you intend this for mage players?
Yes. So one of the things that when Phil and I were talking about this book in particular in its earliest stages, because it took a little while for it to kind of get off the ground, but in the earliest stages when we were first talking about this book, one of the things that we really liked and that we really touched on was this idea of partnership and making alliances within and amongst folks who had been sort of marginalized, left for dead, discounted, et cetera, by the larger traditions. And this idea of, you all have been so busy fighting the technocrats all these years, the technocratic union, that's been your focus. You all have A, ignored us, and B, you all have ignored the larger problem, which is, the rise of even worse nephandic forces throughout the world and throughout the various iterations of the universe. And so by having the focus be on, like scholars and this idea of sharing knowledge across traditions, that was kind of what we were going for, is this idea of, making alliances and what does it mean to make alliances and to have these kinds of alliances between groups of people who may not necessarily have considered themselves potential allies or people that, hey, I never thought I would be working with this person, but, here I am, or I never thought that I would ever take anything that, a person from this tradition might, whatever they might say. I didn't think I would ever take them seriously, but because we are fighting this common enemy now, I'm far more willing to pay attention to the knowledge that these people have. I'm willing to try things this way, or I'm willing to look at things from a different perspective, the way that these people do, when ordinarily I never would have even given them the time of day. And it's largely because if we don't unite, then we're going to have far bigger problems on our hands than anything we've faced before.
The Hermetic Ngoma have become a full recognized house of Hermes in Mage 20. They must have distinguished themselves since the early 2000s. How do you see the Hermetic Ngoma interacting with the independent Ngoma? Are they close? Are they distant? Or what do you think the level of trust is between them?
I'm not really sure sometimes. Like when I was first writing this, I was like, I think that faction, the Hermetic faction of the Ngoma, it was kind of like a necessary evil at the time, because again, the ultimate goal is you need to acknowledge that we are the origin of your entire tradition. You would not have a tradition were it not for the Ngoami and our knowledge that essentially was looted from our libraries. You would not have the knowledge and the abilities that you do were it not for us. We don't want to be acknowledged as some, oh, well, yeah, we'll acknowledge you as sort of an offshoot of us. No, we want you to acknowledge us as you got what you learned from us. And yes, you developed it and took it in your own directions. And yes, now you are your own tradition, but you need to acknowledge where your origins are. And so I think that originally those Ngoma who were seeking acknowledgement from the Hermetics, it was more of a, okay, this is a necessary evil just to get a seat at the table. But now that we have this kind of group that's operating outside of the traditions, I see there being kind of factions, maybe that there are some that are like, okay, well, let's talk to our brothers and sisters who are within the, who are within the Hermetics, and see if we can get these negotiations going from the inside, and use our inside track and use our connections there to kind of do the soft diplomacy side of things. And then there are probably those within this disparate tradition that are like, nope, we're not going to negotiate with these people. These people may call themselves Ngoma, but they're not really us. And we encourage them to come home and to take advantage of, the full measure of their heritage, but they would have to walk away from the Hermetics to do that. And so I feel like there probably are some factions within the overall membership that have different attitudes and thoughts about the Hermetic Ngoma and their role in everything, their status within the broader idea of who the Ngoma are in this new Kush initiative as they've imagined themselves.
I guess on hearing this, I could see the Ngoma inside Order of Hermes saying, hey, our craft is active and going places, and why don't we just say thank you to the Hermetics and walk out? It seems like we would get a good reception over there. I could see that happening peacefully, but that might be like a turning point that would start a new campaign rolling. There's this big event happening. This House of Hermes is walking away, and the Order of Hermes is trying to figure out, what does that mean? What do we think of that? And in the midst of this, something else happens, and that can get a game kicked off. So yeah, that is a great idea. I like that. Thanks for getting us thinking in those directions.
No
the
problem.
Chapter has great descriptions of using mystic astrology to read the stars and predict possible futures. This fits well with the Ngoma leadership and planning strengths. Do you see Ngoma player characters keeping in touch with their leaders to hear these predictions? Do you see it as something that helps keep the craft together?
I think it is. It's one of those things that where you are in the world determines the kind of stars that you see. But regardless of where you are in the world, you can always look up at the stars and, use those celestial maps, that those celestial harmonies and what you're seeing up in the sky as a means of divination, of communication, of connection. And I feel like that in particular, because we're talking about a group of people who were devastated by the slave trade and who, were nearly destroyed through the destruction of their libraries and the dispersal of their peoples across the world, that a system that allows you to utilize, the cosmos, the sky above you, and all of the magical resonances and possibilities that exist with that as a means of working, of communicating, of connecting with the ancestors, with other members of your craft. I think that would be important. And it is something that I believe that younger practitioners of the craft would certainly be taught to do and encouraged to do as much as possible. And, it also makes it easier for people to stay in communication with their elders, with their cousins, with, their aunties and uncles in the metaphorical sense all over the world. And to just make sure that everybody's on the same page, or if everybody's not on the same page, to have that heads up before they meet with a certain group of people. Or, I'm walking into Baltimore and I know, there's a small library here. Who runs this library? Who am I going to be talking to? And, being able to connect with that, have that connection in a very practical way, that, hey, I'm going to do a little stargazing to see who I'm dealing with here before I go and walk into this building. That's something that, just even in terms of game mechanics, would be an easy thing for a storyteller to utilize and for players to utilize as well. That doesn't require a whole lot. It's not, grand magic on a massive scale, but it's just kind of like, I'm going to go look up the sky for a little while, and then you come back with information, and it's kind of like, well, okay then.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. It's a great idea. Well, I see elements of pride within the Ngoma that are difficult for them to see, but they make sense given their history. Did you try to add depth to the craft with this?
Yes. I think that when Phil and I were looking at some of the old write-ups that were in previous books of the Ngoma, and there was this idea, this sense that it was pride that caused their downfall. We both thought it was hilarious that the reason why they are so critical of the Hermetics and often chastise the Hermetics for their pride is because they know where that road leads. They know the kind of disaster that comes from locking yourself up in your ivory tower and believing yourself invincible because you have all of the knowledge and you have all of the esoteric ways of and rituals and connections to, phenomenal cosmic powers and all this other stuff. But, it's the little things. It's the things you don't see coming that can trip you up. And so I felt that to give these people depth and to kind of make their resurgence more meaningful, it's kind of like, sometimes the most satisfying redemption stories are those that we tell about people who have fallen from incredible heights and have been cast into, the most abject of situations where they've nearly lost everything, or they have lost everything, and yet they've managed to beat the odds and come back from that stronger and wiser and with a more tempered and humble vision. Their visions are no less grand, but they have a learned humility in that. Are they still very proud of their traditions? Oh, hell yeah. But it's not that arrogant pride that blinds to potential dangers and problems. It's, the honest pride in, this tradition that we've kept alive in spite of everything. And yes, we're proud of it, but we're not so arrogant in it that we are unwilling to share, that we're unwilling to listen, that we're unwilling to, bend when we need to bend, or take advice, or graciously accept a warning when we're given one. So I did put that in there to create that depth and to allow for, maybe a little bit of tension, because, there are always going to be those people who operate with absolute arrogance in their own abilities and in their traditions. And, my way is the best way, and your way is dust, and how dare you think that you are as good as I am. You're always going to have those people. But I think it brings something to have people who are fiercely proud of and protective of their traditions, and yet they don't fall into that trap of arrogance that they did so long ago.
3 character concepts are a starting point for new players: warrior, scholar, librarian, and griot, or storyteller. I think these help new players jump into a game. What roles do you see Ngoma player characters adding to a cabal of mages?
Oh gosh, I mean, every cabal should have an Ngoma, in my opinion, mainly because I think it brings something to a cabal when you have someone who has access to indigenous knowledge. So this isn't your traditional hermetic. We've got a library in the Western sense of a library. We have this massive Western library, and we have our approved authoritative scholars and all of that. It's the definition of what they call a library is broader and more expansive. And they have this wealth of knowledge that can come from just truly creative and interesting and unique places. And kind of the juicy tension that can be explored within Cabal of, well, you expect me to trust that? You expect me to, you went and listened to some drums and now you say you know what we need to do? What? Are you kidding me? And yet the surprise when it's like, okay, I told you. And yes, this is a reliable source. And, ignore me at your peril, or finding ways to have a cabal meet, trust their fellow member, and yet have to work with another cabal or work with someone else who's just completely dismissive of them. And the ways that creates really interesting story hooks, or a player in the cabal who is brand new to their craft and still trying to learn and navigate this new system that it's like, okay, I'm brand new to this being awake thing, and now I've got this ancient tradition and I'm getting all this information from all these weird and wacky places, but it kind of works. And it's, I think it's exciting. It can be exciting for new characters. I like this idea of the warrior scholar, that we often like to have that stereotype of, there is unfortunately this stereotype when we talk about characters from African backgrounds. It's like, oh, the noble warrior, it's like, okay, yeah, the indigenous warrior trope. Yeah, we get that. But I liked the idea of, I'm a scholar first, but I'm also a warrior. And
Okay.
the depth of character that you can get with that. Same thing with librarians. Like one of my favorite television shows of the past, I guess, decade was, and of course the movies were great too, but I really loved the television show, was The Librarians. And just this idea of a group of just niche specialists in various areas going around saving the world just because they're library. They may have combat skills, they may have, other things that make them, not just nerds that love books, but the idea that knowledge is incredibly powerful, and some of the most powerful people on the planet are literally librarians, because they know how to find the knowledge. They know where the knowledge is. They are the keepers of that knowledge and of those resources, and how to get them, how to manipulate them. That can be a super powerful thing for any cabal. And then, of course, the griot is a storyteller. Anybody who's a good raconteur can make adventures with their cabal some of the most hilarious and delightful storytelling or role-playing experiences that you've ever had around a table. That's partly why I landed on those particular three concepts, because, they seemed like they'd be really fun to play with this particular craft.
The aid from the ancestors' merit looks really good. A benefit, but kind of a drawback at the same time. A great aid for new players that gives a storyteller a hook to use. What did you intend for this to add to games?
Many spiritual traditions that originated on the African continent involve this concept of direct communication with one's ancestors. Most people, I guess, who were not familiar with the actual spiritual traditions of African nations are probably, the most they've had in contact with that is from the movie Black Panther, and this idea of going into the spirit lands to directly talk to your ancestors. But that comes from somewhere, and that comes from very real spiritual traditions all throughout the African continent. And those traditions, we see aspects of that in, for example, voodoo and candomblé, and those practices that the Bata'a, for example, are particularly skilled at. And I wanted for Ngoma characters, they're getting water from the spring. They're part of a tradition that has not had to be cobbled together from all kinds of different things, like the Bata'a, or like some of the other traditions of the diaspora. These are people who are being taught to have that direct connection with the ancestors, and to get in the practice of formulating a personal relationship with your ancestors, to the point where when you do need them, that you can call on them for advice. And depending on how they feel about you and what you're doing on any particular given day, they may leap to help you and give you lots of advice that you don't even want, or they may ignore you pointedly because they don't like what you're doing, or you haven't talked to them, or you only talk to them when you want something. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword, but it is almost like having a family member by your side all the time, even though they may have lived 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. They're still your family member, and they're still willing to help you out as long as you work on your end of the relationship and treat them well, and don't just call them when you need something.
Well, I have 4 questions from our listeners. They added this on Discord before the episode. And for those of you listening, if you would like to put in questions on future interviews, you can meet us on our Discord server. We'll have a link in the show notes for you. Nicholas asks, if you had more space, what would you have added?
A lot, actually. I would have liked to have added something about the work that some of the Ngoma are doing to sort of clean up the mess that some of the early Hermetics made in, when they absconded with all of this knowledge that they looted from the libraries, and that they really didn't understand because they didn't have the context and the background and the experience with working with various entities and doing particular rituals, et cetera, that, a lot of dumb stuff happened, and a lot of really horrible things were unleashed upon the innocent, sleepers in particular, because of just stupid stuff that these European mages did, stupid things on as characterized by the Ngoma. But there was one thing that I kind of put as the hook in the fiction part, which was this idea of this idiot billionaire buying Aleister Crowley's house, and now the ancestors need us to go set it on fire. And I took that from very real accounts of people having bought Boleskine House in Inverness, and just it caught on fire, and nobody knows who set the fire or why it was on fire, but suddenly it was on fire. And why would that happen? And I wanted to talk particularly about these groups of Ngoma that go around and they are trying to put these bad spirits back in their containers because, stupid people like Aleister Crowley embarked on, a 3-year ritual, and at the last minute decided to go visit a friend somewhere and left the ritual undone. And it's like, well, what does that do? You left the door wide open. And so who knows what waltzed out and is hanging out in this house now and calls it home. And whenever somebody buys it, they start messing around with it. And so we just need to go burn the thing down. And sometimes that's the answer. We just need to burn the thing down and salt the earth. We'll get rid of the problem. And then in other cases, it's like, okay, we don't want to scare people, so we have to find a way to go and undo what people have inadvertently done. So they didn't knowingly intend to cause harm, but what they've done has, by continuously performing this ritual, for example, and performing it in a way that leaves out this very vital part that they didn't get and they didn't know because that was passed down through oral tradition and wasn't written down. You've been opening up doorways or causing harm to happen that you didn't realize you were causing to happen every time you do this ritual. So, kind of like this task force that goes out and asks cabals and groups where they know there's a member of the Ngoma present, hey, can you grab your friends and go either look into this or check this out or see if you can stop this thing, because we figured out why this problem is happening. It's because so-and-so did this and used this ritual and it was done wrong. So can you go and fix it? Can you go and just hold things here until we can send people to take over and do things the right way, or shut this down, or whatever, fill in the blank. So yeah, that's what I would have added more of, is this idea that part of that New Kush initiative is not just let's go and retrieve all of our stolen stuff and let's go share what we know and bring people back into the fold. It's like, okay, it kind of is our fault that our stuff is out here causing problems. So we need to go and help clean this up. And just that idea of that there is this group dedicated to essentially spiritual fixing. They're like the spiritual fixers.
Okay.
of stuff that was unleashed thanks to distortion of or misuse of their rituals and traditions.
Faust asks, what do you imagine the key language sounding like?
Key language. So as a background here, one of the ways that I conceptualize the entirety of the Mage universe is that, and it comes a lot from, of all things, unified string theory, this idea that every single thing in the universe is made up of these vibrating strings of energy, and that those strings are all vibrating at different frequencies, and that allows physical matter to exist and, allows us as physical beings to interact with things and see things and perceive things in different ways. And I've always thought that regardless of tradition, if you are an awakened individual, you are tuned into the language of the universe. Now, however that presents itself to you, that's the lens through which you see all of those resonating connections that bind everything together in the universe. And I think for the Ngoma, key language is a way to form an intermediary between the sounds of the universe, or the sounds that allow someone to create things or manipulate the stuff of the universe, and the very limited amount of human speech sounds that we can make. And to the point where in key language, you're making sounds that are not necessarily within the traditional range of human speech sounds. So if you can imagine someone opening their mouth and saying words that sound like drums, but no drum, be able to, because you are speaking this magical language, you are able to make those sounds that human beings otherwise would never be able to make. And they are language and speech sounds that may have once been spoken on Earth, but nobody in the modern age has ever heard them, so we don't know. But that to me is, key language. I guess to answer the main question, use your imagination, but it should be something that is distinctly not sound that humans make, or even that animals make. It's something that is in between, like, say, the absolute inhuman things that a Nefandus would utter, or the sounds that astral beings and whatnot would utter, and things that humans would utter. It's kind of somewhere in between.
Every Night Canine asks, what ideas did you keep in mind when considering the Ngoma paradigm?
Really, I guess ones that I've already mentioned before. This idea of they are keepers of knowledge. That to me is the central idea within their particular paradigm, is that they are the keepers of knowledge, that it is more important to go underground and preserve the knowledge that you have and spread that knowledge secretly and silently and keep your tradition going, than it is to be loud, than it is to jump into a very showy fight, than it is to be on the stage and in front of everybody's face, or a known player or a known entity. This idea that even though they have a grand history and a grand tradition, they are quiet. They operate quietly. They are scholars. Knowledge is important, but it's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It is the idea of tradition and, dare I say, tribe, even though it's not nearly as simplistic as tribe. But this idea of family and connection through shared knowledge, through a shared tradition, through a shared culture and community. Those were sort of the driving ideas behind the Ngoma, and this desire to reunify, remake, and rebirth something that was lost, to regain something that was lost, to patch it back together and create something new and better out of the scraps that you were left with. I mean, that's why I included that story of Ade and the Golden Rice, because it really does epitomize who these people are. This idea of, we're going to go all over the world. We're going to go back and find every single grain of rice that was scattered by this massive storm. So that, I think, is the centralized idea that I was thinking of when thinking of their paradigm and who they are, what they believe, and how they approach being awakened people in the world.
Well, I will share a link with the listeners that lists your books on DriveThruRPG so people can see what you have been up to. And before we sign off, is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
I'm just pleased as punch that, people are still reading the things that I write, that other writers and other contributors to this great work that they write, that you all are still playing this game, that you're still excited about it. I am currently, I guess about 4 months away from trying to defend my dissertation. So I'll actually be able to start playing games again after many, many years of not being able to, because I was very busy. But it excites me that there are people who are still out here playing these games, who are still interested in playing characters in this vision of the universe that I enjoy so much, that I have played in, that I've written for, and that I still love all these years later.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your evening with us. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Bluesky, Mastodon, and Threads. The links are in the show notes. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes. We have a YouTube channel now where you can find our episodes. There's a link in the show notes, but you can also search YouTube for Mage the Podcast. You'll find us. This episode was assisted greatly by our executive producers, and I want to thank them now. Oracle Derek Semsick, Oracle Jason Vines, Oracle Droncap, Oracle Ben Bandelo, Oracle Sean Gallagher, Oracle The Crew of Erebus, Oracle Mikhail, Oracle Puka G, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Guy Stewart, Oracle Buck Gregory, Oracle Bad Company, Oracle Spartacus, Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Jeff Waugh, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aaron, Archmaster Simon Strand, Archmaster Wolf Larison, Morris Hopkins, Jervis Johnson, EBG, George Lara, Will Vincent, Shartan, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Tyler Bryan, Jason Duncan, Sev Nessus, Bubba the Pale One, Henry Kraft, Eric Schwenk, Starfish, Ambiversion, Ryan Stray, Lulls and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kelric, Alexia, Patrick McNamara, Blaze Hibbert, Rachel Grace, Daniel Scribner, Ricardo, Rob H., Alex, Nikita Klaimanov, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Anders S., Bryce Perry, Michael Parker, Jeremy Z., Melissa Krause, Ian Robertson, Curtis Hendricks, That's Real Neato, Sig, Manuel Canos, Darren Hennessy, Eli Levenger, David Rowe, Jason Kennedy, Samuel Tobin, Nibero, Dennis Osborne, Jenna F., Chris Kinner, Gray Trilug H., Daniel Cuppen, Ryan Kendi, Ia Bull, Stefan Carton. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox.